a lecturer in law at the City Law School at the City University of London, received his PhD from Osgoode Hall Law School, York University in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. He's a qualified lawyer as well and served as a legal advisor to the Negotiations Affairs Department of the PLO. His main areas of research are constitutional law and international law, and he also has an interest in academic freedom. Among his publications, 2013 article called Love Suspended, Demography, Comparative Law, and Palestinian Couples in the Israeli Supreme Court. That was published in Social and Legal Studies, an international journal. And in the middle, we have Adam Haniya, who is a senior lecturer in development studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. His recent books include Capitalism and Class in the Gulf Arab States, Lineages of Revolt, Issues of Contemporary Capitalism in the Middle East, and Transit States, which he co-edited, Labor Migration and Citizenship in the Gulf, Pluto Press. He's a member of the advisory board of the Center for Palestine Studies at SOAS and an editorial board member of the journal Historical Materialism, Research in Critical Marxist Theory. He published a book, an article recently called The Politics of Curfew in the Occupied Territories in a book edited by Joel Benin and Rebecca Stein called The Struggle for Sovereignty, Palestine and Israel. And on my left, last but not least, we have Gudrun Harrer, who is a senior editor of the Austrian daily newspaper Der Standard, a quality newspaper. Previously, she was foreign news editor at the paper, one of Austria's best papers. Her academic background includes Islamic, Arabic, and international relations studies. With an MA and a PhD, she teaches modern history and politics of the Middle East at the University of Vienna and at the Diplomatic Academy. And she's a former special envoy of the Austrian presidency of the European Union to Iraq and chargé d'affaires of the Austrian embassy in Baghdad. In 2014, she published 2 books, Dismantling the Iraqi Nuclear Program, The Inspections of the International Atomic Energy Agency in Iraq 1991 to 1998 with Routledge, and Nahöstlicher Irrgarten, Analysen abseits des Mainstreams with Kremeyer and Scheriau. In 2007, she received the Felix Ermacora Human Rights Press Award, and in 2014, she received the Bruno Kreisky Award for her publications. So I'm going to start with, well, whoever wants to start, Martin or Adam. Okay, Martin.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me?
Huh?
Now, can you hear me? No? Okay. Good evening, and thank you, Anthony. So today I'm going to talk about an assessment of possible constitutional frameworks for a one-state option. And I'm going to focus on constitutional models, so law and constitutional models. And as you know, law and constitutions are really intertwined with statehood. And the constitution or constitutional law is what decides the different powers of the state, allocation of power within the state, relationship between the citizens and the state, and other important matters. So I'm going to start with a discussion of guidelines and guiding principles against which I'm going to assess the different models. And then I'm going to discuss a number of models, 3 under what I call unitary state, and 2 under federal state. To start with, for the guiding principles, and here you're going to see that there's a lot of, many of these things are things that you just heard about in the earlier panel, especially when the discussant discussed the initiative that she's working on. And in deciding on these principles, these are principles that are meant first to address the current situation and the problems and the injustices of the current situation, and also to deal with potential problems that will arise in the future. Many of them are questions that are important for any discussion on constitutional design, but I'm going to focus on particular on the ones that we are most interested in this conflict. The first one is equal citizenship. Lack of equality between Palestinians and Israelis is probably one of the single most important problems today. Now, if we were to describe or classify the inhabitants of the area between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean today, according to the rights that they have by law, you'll find that there are about 6 different categories. Now, on the top, we have the Israeli Jews, who have enjoy the full spectrum of rights, and their rights and interests almost automatically trump the rights of the other categories. And second, we have the Palestinians who were not expelled in 1948 and have Israeli citizenship. And they have formal citizenship and a measure of civil rights and political rights, but at the same time, they do not enjoy full equality. And they do not enjoy the full spectrum of rights. The third category is Palestinians of East Jerusalem, who are, by Israeli law, are residents of Israel, but not citizens. And their status is tenuous in that it is seen as a temporary status. So if somebody leaves for more than 7 years, for example, or they relocate, they lose the rights, including the right to live in Jerusalem. The fourth category is Palestinians of the West Bank, who live under Israeli occupation. Of course, there's the Palestinian Authority, which deals with the day-to-day services like healthcare or education. But at the end of the day, the ultimate control, is in the hands of the Israeli army. The fifth category is the Palestinians who live in the Gaza Strip, which is legally still under Israeli control. And this represents the most severe situation, because it's under the state of siege, prohibition of movement of people and goods, of course, periodic bouts of violence visited upon the population by Israel, and all these things make the situation drastically more serious than the West Bank. And finally, there's the group of the most disenfranchised group, which is the Palestinian refugees. And these are Palestinian refugees, both living in refugee camps in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, but also in other neighboring countries such as Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. So any solution has to address all of these categories and should be built on equality, both legal equality, legal and political equality, and also at the same time, social equality. And equality should extend to cultural, linguistic, and religious rights. So that's number one. Number two is, which is related to number one, is immigration, residency, and citizenship laws and policies. The categories that I described earlier are actually the outcomes of legislation, of laws and policies that have been implemented since the creation of Israel. And if you look at the trends, we'll see that one of the trends since 1948 is an attempt to increase the number of Jews in Israel by massive Jewish immigration, including by legislative means, the law of return, for example, that allows anybody who's Jewish to immigrate with their family, and includes also cash payment upon coming to Israel. So Israel is probably the only country in the world that pays people or the right kind of people, to immigrate to the state. On the other hand, we have the expulsion of the Palestinians of 1948, and at the same time, we have discriminatory immigration and citizenship policies. And these discriminatory immigration and citizenship policies are not just in the area of immigration and citizenship, because they also reflect trends in the Israeli law and Israeli society. And some of the ways of discrimination in Israel, for example, is by citing laws or eligibility according to the Israeli law of return. The third principle that I'm going to talk about is group rights. So the population in historic Palestine, or in Israel and the West Bank, is belongs to two main groups. So Jewish Israelis and Palestinians. But these groups also are diverse. So we have, among Jewish Israelis, for example, there are people who come from North Africa and Arab countries, others who come from Europe, others who came from Russia, who speak Russian, others who speak Amharic. And on the Palestinian side, we have, the division is mostly probably on the religious basis. So we have Muslims and Christians. But the most important division, the division that actually is the main point of distinction, and the one that's most relevant for rights, is the division between Israeli Jew and Palestinian. And this distinction also overlaps with another distinction, which I'm going to talk about later on, which is distinction between settler and indigenous. Now, these two groups have their own distinctive languages, culture, heritage, and religion. And in order to achieve a stable settlement, any model chosen should account for the diversity of the population, and constitutional principles of the state and the institutions should acknowledge the fact that we have two groups with different identities that should be accommodated. Equally important, the fact that we recognize the identities and accommodate the identities does not mean dominance of one group over the other, or special rights or privileges for one group against the other, as is the situation today. The fourth principle is historical redress, or transitional justice and transformative constitutionalism. So constitution change in post-conflict context cannot be a tool to preserve the past. At the same time, we cannot really imagine a constitution that does not address the conflict, that's totally separate from the conflict, its history and its injustices and underlying causes. So in this sense, the Constitution should play a dual role. The first one is to anchor and facilitate transitional justice and transitional justice measures such as truth-telling, reparation, reconciliation. And at the same time, the Constitution should be forward-looking and transformative, in that it should mark a break between the past injustices and inequities and the beginning of new constitutional order. The fifth principle is decolonization. Colonialism, and more specifically settler colonialism, lies at the heart of the conflict between the Palestinians and Jewish Israelis. And the conflict is not just ethnic or national in nature, but also the division is along settler and indigenous lines. And we have the dynamics that are similar to dynamics in other parts of the world, in other conflicts, where the settler society has almost full control over the state, and indigenous society is resisting the status quo. Since colonialism is one of the significant issues at the heart of the conflict, any attempt to resolve it should address this question. And by addressing this question, I mean decolonization. And decolonization does not mean that people should leave or should go away. What it means is that they should account for the privileges that this colonial situation provides, and should leave or give up on the privileges and the extra rights that they currently enjoy, which lead to the existing injustices and problems in the region, or in the area of Israel and Palestine. So it should be a way of looking at things towards transforming society and transforming the thinking, and not just to preserve the privileges. Now, with these principles in mind, I'm going to look at the different models. And the first one is, under a unitary state, is a liberal model, or a model that is blind to the difference among the citizens. And in this sense, this state is one that does not adopt any preference for the citizens' values or principles, and views the citizens first and foremost as individuals and provides its citizens with full range of liberal rights and liberties and entitlements, regardless of their belonging. It adopts a policy of difference blindness when it comes to identity of the citizens. Now, while there are states that adopt this policy of neutrality in some areas, such as religion, for example, in reality, the state cannot really be fully neutral for practical reasons. So if you're fully, because at the end of the day, you have, for example, to adopt a language that the people are going to communicate with the state with and deal with the state, etc. So rather, what exists in reality are states that try to promote what Charles Taylor calls the politics of universalism. So the state seeks to converge on a single national identity and culture that is blind to the differences among the citizenry. And this approach applies to official or public areas, but not to the private sphere. But it should be noted that what is seen as one difference-blind universal equality is in reality not universal, because it provides a preference for certain particular cultures. It does promote a hegemonic culture, or as Charles Taylor says again, it's particularism masquerading as the universal. So adopting such a model will raise some difficulties. For example, if we look at the numbers and if we look at what the model would look like, currently, based on numbers, there's no one hegemonic culture that people are going to clearly support, because Palestinians are not going to become Israelis and vice versa. So there's no one identity or one single national identity or culture that the state can promote. It might be able to promote some neutral principles such as equality, etc. But at the same time, there will be an issue with what languages to use, how to deal with issues of cultural identity, and also at the same time, the fact that the state does not acknowledge any differences among the citizens and sees them as uniform might raise other problems with, for example, affirmative action schemes or transitional justice. So while there's much to admire about the emphasis on universal equality among citizens, this kind of equality assumes uniformity as contrary to the realities of most societies. And this understanding of equality in here is only in the narrow sense. The model also presents a challenge to the issue of group rights, because the state was not going to present, because the state does not really acknowledge the identities, the different identities, so it's going to be harder to recognize and accommodate group rights. So this is the first model. The second one is the binational model. And in as much as the term binationalism is raised and debated on, there isn't really any full articulation of the idea in academic writing, except what Layla discussed earlier in the ideas of Brit Shalom or Ehud from the 1940s. But nevertheless, one can identify a number of ideas associated with this kind of thinking. And the origin of this thinking is that the idea that a state has to be associated with one national group. And the understanding of that group that dealt with it, which is mostly people who migrated from Eastern and Central Europe, was that a state has to be associated with one nation, and the nation here is understood mostly in ethnographic or ethnocentric way. And so if the state has to be associated with one group, then in this case, binational, the state will be associated with two different groups. And to talk about the level of the practicalities, one can divide binationalism into three levels. The first one is declarative binationalism, where binationalism would be expressed on a declarative level as recognition by the state through the constitution or other legal instruments, and recognizes the fact that the majority of the citizens belong to two national groups. But this clause should be kept at declarative level, which means that the fact that it's declared in the constitution does not give any special rights or extra rights to members of these groups. The second one is binationalism as cultural autonomy and also official adoption of symbols. So this level goes beyond the declarative and adds active measures to give expression to the group preferences. So the two groups are recognized, and also the state grants cultural autonomy to members of these groups, or to the groups also as groups. So this cultural autonomy extends to functional areas such as religion, religious institutions, cultural institutions, which could include education system, media organizations, universities, research institutes, organizations that deal with cultural production. In addition to this, the recognition of the equal status of both languages. And recognition of or this recognition will extend to the symbols of the state. The third level of binationalism is the one that also introduces binationalism into governance, which in this case mostly resembles the model that's known as consociationism, which is a model that was developed by Arndt Lipphardt, which aims at dividing and sharing the control over the state between different groups or multiple groups. And the model has a number of elements. First one, for example, is power sharing of the executive, proportional representation of the groups in parliament and other institutions such as the army, the civil service, etc. The third one is mutual veto powers, and the fourth one is segmental autonomy, which is similar to cultural autonomy. And these could be implemented in a number of ways. Now, an assessment of binationalism shows that in as much as there's some promise, and Layla touched upon some of the problems that binationalism could solve, also at the same time we have a number of serious problems. And the first problem is group definition. So two questions arise here. The first one is, who are the relevant groups? Who are these two, the bi and the binational? Now, and also, who's going to decide who are these groups? So on the one hand, we have the option of having the Jewish Israelis as a group, which sociologically, many sociologists have said that in the past 65 years, during the existence of the State of Israel, a unique culture has developed, which is different or independent from Jewish culture. And you can say that there is a Jewish collective, or an Israeli collective now. On the other hand, if we look at the Israeli political culture, most politicians, Israeli constitutional law, what Israeli courts, so Israeli courts, for example, in at least 3 separate occasions declared that there's no such thing as an Israeli nation. So even this question is still not settled among Israelis itself. So that's one of the problems, one of the issues. On the Palestinian side, it's a little bit easier, but if you dig deeper also, you might find some similar issues. The other issue is that let's say we define the groups, the question would be who will belong to these groups. So the question of who is a Jew, for example, in Israel has been one of the main constitutional debates in the history of Israeli constitutional law. So definition of who's Jewish. And it's still an ongoing issue that the Knesset, government, the courts have discussed and are going to continue discussing in the future. And at the same time, the question of who's Palestinian is going to arise. And if we want to adopt a binational model where there is importance to actually how people are defined, then there might become a time that we have to actually legally define who's Jewish and who's not Jewish, or who's Jewish and who's Palestinian, which is a very problematic aspect, if you ask me, because it takes away from the thrust of the importance and the strength of the idea of citizenship. So instead of asking who's a citizen, we'll be busy asking what is the affiliation or what's the lineage of every person. Similarly, if there are people, what about people who do not want to affiliate? So there's a problem of compelled association here. And there are people, and we're going to get in a situation where there are people who actually do not belong to any group, but nonetheless are part of society. And for example, one of the problems in Bosnia, for example, was that there were members of the Roma population, Roma community in Bosnia, members of the Jewish community in Bosnia who wanted to run for elections in one of the houses of parliament. And by law, they were not able to do it because they did not belong to any of the what's known as the constituent nations, which is either Serbs, Croats, or Bosnians. And it went all the way to the European Court of Human Rights that said, no, this is a violation of human rights. Now, another problem is the emphasis on the national or ethnic belonging in politics in a manner that's conducive to highlighting what divides the polity rather than what unites it. So if you adopt it as on the level of governance, then political power will be channeled through ethnic affiliation rather than through the idea of citizenship. Now, in addition to these particular concerns, if we look at the academic literature on constitutionalism, we see that the critics say that it produces weak and undemocratic governance that are dominated mostly by elites. It also hinders the politics of economic distribution, and also weakens democracy because it effectively eliminates or significantly weakens any opposition, which is important to any functioning democratic regime. Now, despite all of these critiques, we can take some of the ideas here and try to neutralize some of the emphasis on the ethnic or national identity in what I call the multicultural model. And multiculturalism is a theory that means different things in different countries. We can find policies that are considered multicultural in places like Canada, in places like New Zealand. But what I'm talking about here is more on the principle and not what happens in these countries. Now, Will Kymlicka, who's one of the leading theorists, identifies three principles. The first one is the idea that the state belongs to all its citizens equally. The second one involves recognition and accommodation to the history, language, and culture of non-dominant groups, as it does to dominant groups. And the third principle relates to past injustices. The state should acknowledge historical injustice and should manifest a willingness to offer some sort of remedy or rectification. And if we look at these principles, these three principles could be useful in imagining another scenario. And if we use, for example, the starting point of equality. So in a multicultural state, everybody will be equal. The starting point will be equality. The relationship between the individual and the state will be based on citizenship, citizenship that's not mediated by any other group affiliation. And at the same time, the state recognizes the difference and the identity difference among the population, that the people belong to two main dominant groups with different languages, culture, history, and should be given a measure of cultural autonomy. For example, here recognition would include recognition of Arabic and Hebrew as official languages of equal status, recognition of the right of the citizens to receive service and communication with the state in both languages on all levels, so municipalities, courts, etc. Also, special arrangement for allowing both languages to be used in government, in parliament, in the courts, official publications. So it would be an official policy of full bilingualism. Cultural autonomy also will be helpful in accommodating the group rights and would allow the groups to make decisions and be involved in running their cultural affiliations or cultural affairs, such as issues relating to education, cultural and artistic production, and religious institutions. So these services or these areas should reflect the needs and the wishes of the group and recognize their distinctive cultures. At the same time, we do not want cultural autonomy to be designed in a manner that highlights adversity or difference. One idea is to adopt cultural autonomy without having to decide on, for example, who's Jewish and who is Palestinian. And one way is to adopt language as a marker. Now, all Palestinians speak Arabic. The majority of Israelis speak Hebrew. Many Palestinians speak Hebrew, but not many Israelis speak Arabic. So one of the ways to deal with it is to have, as an outcome of the equal status of both languages, is to divide or to design the cultural autonomy based on language, which is possible for probably almost everything except for religion. Such that the autonomous institutions, autonomous cultural institutions, will be first and foremost designed and based on language. And this way, the membership in the group will be based on self-identification rather than compelled association, and on preference. So if people are interested in getting service in Hebrew, they'll go to the institutions that provide service in Hebrew. If they're interested in Arabic, they'll go to ones that provide in Arabic. And of course, it should be based on equality between the two kinds of services, two institutions, and also non-discrimination in the provision of these services. Some of the ideas also that are highlighted in consociationism could be adopted without really focusing on ethnic difference. For example, adopting a parliamentary system rather than a presidential system, which is where there's more collaboration, where it's based on cabinet rather than one person who has all of the political power, proportional representation in parliament, and also constitutional entrenchment of the principles that are at the heart of multiculturalism, such as equality, bilingualism, recognition of group rights, and commitment to diversity and acknowledgement of historical injustice. One example here, for example, is South Africa. Now, the principles of democracy, multiracialism, non-racialism, and non-sexism in South Africa are enshrined in Section 1 of the Constitution. Now, to amend the Constitution, the Parliament should vote and the amendment should pass by 66%. But this particular section that deals with these guiding principles has to, or could only be amended with a majority of 75%. 2 minutes. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the federal state. And the issue with federalism is that we can probably have two models. One is based on territorial federalism. So the territories, or so there'll be the federal state, and there'll be different regions, and the federal state will have its own, will have its jurisdiction or areas that it controls, or functional areas that it controls, and the regions will have their also jurisdiction. And one of the problems in implementing this model in our case is the issue of where will the regions be? Where will the borders be? Because whatever the borders that you're going to draw, there's always going to be a minority from the other part, unless you're going to do with really small regions. The other model could be federalism implemented with some form of constitutionalism, which is, we can call it the Belgian or the model that was adopted in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And this could have some advantages, but practical experience and reality shows that there are problems that it actually tends to more entrench the ethnic or linguistic identity at the expense of many other issues, and one of them is, for example, economic distribution. And it tends to create, to some extent, dysfunctional governments and weak governments. So critics who dealt with this issue also highlighted the weakness of this model. Now, the thing that I would end with is that, in my opinion, the multicultural model, which combines the strength of the binational model with more emphasis on the idea of citizenship and also the idea of that we're adding another level or layer of recognition, but not necessarily channeling citizenship through ethnicity, is the most appropriate one. But regardless, there are more discussions to be done, because the constitutional model should also be based on a discussion and debates that should be done mostly bottom-up, because if you want some things to work, they have to be based on incentives, and also it should be based on what the people are likely to agree to. So I'll end with this note, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. We have the next speaker now, immediately. This is Adam Hania.
Okay, can you hear this okay? Yeah. Again, I'd like to begin by thanking everyone for being here today and for being part of this panel. What I want to speak about today really does build a lot on what Tarek spoke on in the earlier panel. I'm going to try and look at the current debates around state building, state formation, and present a critique of the way that this is currently conceived in relation to Palestine. But I'm going to try and do that from looking at the dynamics of the regional political economy. So I'm going to try and link what is happening in the political economy regionally, how this affects the way that we should think about state formation, to ultimately try to answer the question or get some insight into the question of why or what are the social forces within Palestinian society that support the status quo. What is it? Who are the people in Palestinian society that have a stake in the partition solution, as we heard it described in the panel this morning? So I think this is very important, and I'll come to why I think this is important towards the end, in terms of how we think about moving towards any kind of alternative. So that's the kind of ground I hope to cover. So I'm going to essentially look at two parts to my presentation today. The first one, I'm going to present some of the key arguments within the state formation or the state building project as it is dominantly conceived. In other words, as governments see it, as international institutions see it, how it's unfolding in the Palestinian Authority context. I'm going to look at those debates and then look at some of the criticisms about those debates and try and raise, to my mind, what I think is substantive criticism, and that is how the notion of the state itself is seen within the state building literature. So that's the first part. And then the second part, I'm going to look at this question of the regional political economy, trying to trace some of the dynamics of Palestine in the region, and looking at what that means for how Palestinian society has evolved, and again related to this question of the social-based social forces of the status quo. So to begin with the state building debate, there's not much time to go into this in too much detail, and there's been a lot written on this, but I'm talking here at a general level. In the 1990s and 2000s, the emergence of quite a vigorous debate about how do you build a state? What are the requirements of a good state, a stable state, a successful state? Now, this literature and these debates emerged at a very particular context. And there are two things I want to highlight. Firstly, this was a time when the neoliberal paradigm that Tarek spoke about really began to, became so prevalent across the whole world, not just the Middle East, but globally. This idea that we needed market-led growth, encouragement of the private sector, opening up economies, free trade, and so forth. And we're all very well aware of the policies that have been associated with neoliberalism since that time. The second trend was the emergence of a number of conflicts, notably in places like Somalia, Iraq, Afghanistan, Sudan, the Congo, which really posed the question of what to do in the conflict situation, what to do post-conflict, how do we reconstruct states post-conflict. So these two features of the debate, the state-building debate, came together in two theoretical propositions. The first one was that successful states needed to twin, on one side, democratic institutions, and on the other side, a market-led economic structure. Okay? This is famously encapsulated in George Bush's statement in 2004, post the Iraq War, where he said, American policy in the Middle East is based on two principles: free elections and free markets. Okay? This was the thrust of the state-building approach, as it was conceived in many circles, certainly dominant circles. That's the first feature. The second feature is that there was a linkage made between state building and successful states and peace. In other words, the argument was made, and this argument has a long pedigree in international relations theory, that successful states or stable states do not go to war with one another, that it's possible that it's those states that have failed that are more likely to have both external conflict as well as internal conflict. So again, state building was necessary in order to ensure peace. Now, later on I'll talk about how this comes together in the Palestinian context, but this causal relation, I think you can already see that in the Palestinian context it's quite clear. Now, based upon these two theoretical propositions, the dominant approach to state building outlined what was seen as three core features of successful states. And this is very, very prevalent in the work we see globally as well as in the Palestinian context. These three features are firstly authority. So these are features that successful states need to have as it's been proposed. So authority, in other words, the state needed to have the ability to project its political power over the territory that it controls, and particularly to maintain law and order. Okay? So the question of authority. The second core attribute or key attribute of successful states was the capacity of the state. So in other words, the state had to be able to provide services, provide infrastructure, provide for the well-being of its citizen population, dispense justice, collect revenue, and so forth. And then thirdly, the third core feature was legitimacy, highlighted as being legitimacy. States needed to have a belief, or citizens needed to believe in the state itself, to believe that this state was legitimate, and that it was it should be able to express its authority, it should be able to provide capacity. Now, I think those three features, authority, capacity, legitimacy, you can see are very much interrelated and self-reinforcing. A state that is not able to deliver capacity is unlikely to be legitimate. A state that is not legitimate is more difficult to be able to implement its authority, and so forth. There's a self-reinforcing relationship here. So this kind of interconnected triumvirate between authority, capacity, legitimacy really has been highlighted in the last couple of decades as the core features of any successful state-building project. Now, In this debate, there have been two phases, if you like. The first phase was focused very much on the technocratic or the technical side of state building. In other words, really the authority and the capacity side of things, not so much the legitimacy side. Then the second phase that's come more recently has been an emphasis on the legitimacy leg. In other words, trying to explain why state building has failed in numerous circumstances through the lack of legitimacy that states have been attributed to. Now, as you can see, I'm speaking generally here, but you can see that all of what I've said, it's very much the case of Palestine and the Palestinian Authority have been very much prominent. The Palestinian Authority really is a global laboratory for these kinds of debates. Okay, this is, I think, quite clear. And Tarek spoke about how state building has been conceived in the Palestinian context, very much actually focusing on the capacity and authority legs, looking in particular, Tarek mentioned the Palestine Reform and Development Plan of 2007, November 2007. This was a plan that really guided development under the Palestinian Authority since that time. It's no longer called the PRDP, now it's called the PNDP, the Palestine National Development Plan, and a new one was just released in, I think, April last year. But it's the same basic idea in all of these development strategies is the neoliberal development model that Tarek explained this morning, combined with fiscal austerity at the level of the state, and then, very importantly, the question of security. Okay? And in fact, in the PRDP itself, the largest portion of all funding went to the security budget. Okay? And we saw a big expansion of prisons across the West Bank, expansion of security forces. So you can see PA state building, or at least the way the institutions have conceived PA state building, has been through this technocratic lens, neoliberal oriented development model, and the question of developing the capacity of security. Now, this model has come under sustained criticism, and we heard some of that this morning. And the criticism has focused on a number of levels, and I don't have time to go into detail on this, but many people have pointed out that the problem with this model in the Palestinian context is that when you talk about security, and security is highlighted as the key plank of the PRDP, or one of the key planks, when you talk about security, you need to ask security for whom, and in this case, it largely means the security of the occupier. And in a sense, that's what Palestinian state building has largely focused on. Okay? Other people have, and here Mushtaq Khan, actually a colleague of mine at SOAS, has highlighted this point, the question around the legitimacy side of the PA. He has argued that the problem with the state building approach in Palestine is that the Palestinian Authority's legitimacy has been undermined severely because of its apparent support of Israel's security. And because of this, this decline in legitimacy, it's made it much more difficult for the PA to implement its capacity or to spread its capacity across the PA areas, and this has entered into this self-reinforcing circle. So there has been a number of debates around this, and I think the key point is that to talk about state building in this abstracting it from the question of the continuing and ongoing Israeli colonizing project, it's ridiculous in many ways to speak about development and state building while the occupation continues to exist in this way. I think that is all true, and I mean I agree with these criticisms that have been made. What I would like to do, though, is push the criticism a little bit further and say that I think the problem actually lies beyond the question of the continuing presence of the Israeli occupation. And I think the problem actually relates to how the state is seen. And when I'm talking about the state here, I'm not talking about, it's perhaps a little bit different from the way Mazen's been using the term state. I'm talking about the state as a political power. okay? As a government, as an authority. I'm not talking about the nation state or the borders of the country. But I think there's a problem with the way that the state as a political power is understood in this literature. And to my mind, the biggest problem is that there is a separation made between the politics or the political sphere and the economic sphere. There's a separation made between politics and economics. These are seen as two separate things, and the state is seen as being a neutral instrument that stands above economic power, is able to decide, let's do this or let's do that. It's attributed to operate in the interests of the society as a whole, and in that approach, it overlooks or obscures differences in economic power within any society. And I think this is really key in terms of understanding why the status quo exists as it does and what it might mean to look at alternative models. In other words, I think there's a problem with this notion of twinning liberal democracy and free markets, or liberal democracy and neoliberal economic policy. Because what it does, when we talk about individuals and individual rights and responsibilities of civil society and so forth, we obscure the reality of social power that is at the basis of how market-oriented economies operate. And I think this is a very big problem in the Palestinian context, not just the Palestinian context. And there's two aspects that I think are important for how this relates to state formation in Palestine. The first one is going back to this authority, capacity, legitimacy framework that I briefly outlined. This, to my mind, is problematic because what it does is abstracts from power relations, abstracts from economic power in particular. In other words, we need to ask not just authority, capacity, legitimacy, we need to ask authority in whose hands and for whose interests, capacity to do what and in whose interests, and legitimacy in whose eyes. Because those questions, we can never assume that there's an abstract the people or the nation to which we can answer those three points. And the second point is that when we talk about looking at the relationships of power in any society, then clearly on one hand this is inseparable from the settler colonial nature of Israel and the ongoing occupation in the West Bank and Gaza. But I don't think it goes far enough just to say that. I think we need to understand Palestinian social relations, relationships of power in Palestinian society through the regional lens, through the lens of the regional political economy. And I think this can tell us much about the state-building project. And I'm going to move now to the second part of what I wanted to say along those lines. In the paper that I prepared for this workshop, I go into a lot more detail about the dynamics of the regional economy over the last couple of decades. In particular, I point out the ongoing significance of the Middle East and North Africa to global power relations, particularly to the interests of the United States, as well as the European Union, and the way that this has shaped the domestic relations within the Middle East for many, many years, but particularly post the Second World War. The fact that the region still contains a third of the world's oil resources, and I don't have time to look into these factors in detail. I also tried to trace out three regional dynamics that I think are very important over the last couple of decades in the Middle East. The first being the penetration of neoliberal policies throughout all Arab states. This has been, I think, quite clear, and it certainly played a big part in the uprisings that began in 2011, the impact of these neoliberal policies. The second point, and again this relates to something Tarek mentioned this morning, this penetration of neoliberalism was closely connected with normalizing Israel into the regional economy. So Tarek mentioned the New Middle East project, or the New Middle East, Perez's phrasing of it. We can see it in what was called MEFTA, the Middle East Free Trade Area that the Bush administration proposed. We can see it, I think, in the Euro-Mediterranean process to a large extent as well. This attempt to normalize Israel's relationship with Arab economies on the basis of market-led development and to integrate all of the states, including Israel, into a single economic zone. And this hasn't gone away. It's still present, and it's still an emphasis of global policy. So I talk about that, and we can talk about that in more detail in discussion. But the third feature, I think, of the last period, which I think is extremely important to connect to, and that is the role of the Gulf states, the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC, within the regional political economy. And what I'm talking about here is that concurrent with this liberalization process over the last 20 years or so, and particularly since the rise in the oil price beginning 2000, going to 2008, we saw the increased penetration of Arab economies by Gulf-based capital, by Gulf-based investors. Now, this was true both at state level, through sovereign wealth funds and different state funds present in the Gulf, but it was also true through private-based Gulf conglomerates investing in the region. Now, this was particularly focused in states such as Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria to some extent. These were where much of these investments went to. But it was also true in the case of Palestine. And what I mean by this is that if we look from 2003 to 2008, more than 2/3 of total global FDI that went into PA-controlled areas originated in the Gulf region. Okay? Now, this was tiny amount compared to what the Gulf invested elsewhere in the region. It was only less than 1% of their total investments in the Middle East. But for the Palestinian economy, it's significant. Okay? 2/3 of the total global FDI in that period. That's one side. And it's important to recognize that doesn't include government-to-government loans, infrastructure support, these kinds of things. I'm just talking about foreign direct investment. But there's another side to this which is important, and this is the key point that I'm trying to make here. Not only did we get these FDI flows, through the Oslo process, we also got the return of many Palestinian-based conglomerates, Palestinian conglomerates based in the Gulf states. In other words, big corporations, big conglomerates based in the Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia, but not solely Saudi Arabia. We saw the return of many of these investors to Palestine under the PA. Okay? This began in the 1990s, but it's an ongoing process. So in this sense, we see this internationalization of Gulf capital take a different form. It's diaspora, Palestinian diaspora capital that has come back into the areas. Now, this is important, I think, because it tells us something about, if you like, it's the other side of what Tarek described this morning. Tarek spoke about increasing levels of inequality, the exclusion of Palestinian society, unemployment levels, and so forth. The other side to this is the layer of Palestinian society who have benefited from this status quo, who've benefited from the ongoing process. And to my mind, key to that are these the Palestinian conglomerates that have come back. And we can talk about them by name and look at their economic power and economic structure, which I won't do, but it's possible, I think it's very clear in the Palestinian context to map those relationships of power out. And what we see if we do so, that we see that virtually every sector of the Palestinian economy is dominated by these kinds of conglomerates, operating through holding companies or individual ownership, through banking structures, and so forth. And as I said, all of them tend to be have their origins based in the Gulf, still with business activities in the Gulf. Now, the important side to what I'm saying here is that not only do these conglomerates dominate the economic side of PA development, they are also deeply connected with the Palestinian Authority itself through a kind of holding companies where you have PA officials sitting on the same boards as these people, making joint investments. And if you look at the character of Palestinian Authority economic strategy, you can see, to my mind, that this strategy has primarily been based around supporting this layer of Palestinian society. Okay, it's not about delivering any improvement to Palestinian life for the majority of the population. So, for example, we can talk about housing, the housing sector. Okay, a key plank of the PRDP and later the Palestinian National Development Plan. This has been led by these conglomerates. The Palestinian Authority has played a role in providing cheap land to them, encouraging the development of mortgage markets and the debt relationships that we heard about this morning. All of this has benefited very deeply these conglomerates. Okay, they both own the housing development companies as well as the banks that provide the mortgages. Okay, so that's one example. Another example is the industrial zone model that's continually being pushed by the Palestinian Authority on the borders of the kinds of the patchwork of territory that Layla showed us this morning. The industrial zones, again, are owned by the same group of Palestinian society that provided cheap land from the Palestinian Authority, in some cases expropriated or confiscated from Palestinians who didn't want to sell the land, and at the same time provided with tax breaks and so forth. It very much relates to the aid structure that Tariq outlined too. So we can see this in a number of other sectors, which I won't go into since I'm running out of time. But what does this, I'll conclude by noting what the implications of this are for alternatives to this partition model. What does this mean for how we think about alternative models, including the one-state solution in whatever form that might take? I think the important point to emphasize is that, from what I've been saying, is that when we approach the question of state formation, that we don't just take it in the abstract. We don't just approach it as simply a technocratic question of arranging institutional forms that can best meet a checklist of preconceived functions, and usually these have been identified as authority, legitimacy, capacity. I think we need to see the character of the state as not a neutral apparatus, but rather we need to see what are the social forces that have an interest in the status quo, and how might we overcome those social forces in order to get somewhere else. How do we get from A to B, in other words? It's not just a matter of coming up with, okay, this sounds good, this sounds good, this sounds good. It's moral, etc., etc. There are interests that are entrenched in what exists at the current time. And to my mind, not only, obviously, that is the ongoing interests of Zionism and the occupation in particular, or Zionism in all its aspects, but it also means that the Palestinian elites need to be fundamentally challenged as well. We cannot ignore this factor. And I think any alternative model of state formation is not going to be an elite-driven project. It's going to come up against elites, and we need to be cognizant of that fact and take it into account. And I think particularly what it tells us is that the question of the effects of neoliberal policymaking in Palestine, particularly the kinds of inequality that we heard about this morning, fighting against or opposing those kinds of policy is part of building an alternative state, or models of alternative states. We need to tackle those economic inequities. And the final point I would make is that, as I've said, this is not just a question of in Palestine or Palestinian society. in the West Bank. It's not just a question of Israel. It also is a regional question. And it's going to be part of, I think, challenging the regional hierarchies that have emerged over the last few decades, which are deepening by the day, that part of building an alternative model in Palestine is going to be tackling those regional hierarchies in a serious manner. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam. So now we're going to hear from Gudrun Harrer, who's going to ask some questions and make some comments on what we've just heard. So please take it from here, Gudrun.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to this interesting meeting and panel. And of course, thank you very much for this really very interesting and intriguing and of course also very complex presentations. I have a very difficult task and I fear I'm a very inadequate discussant because I'm not deeply involved into this discussion, in the discussion of alternative state building concepts in Israel and Palestine, like all of you are here. I'm a Middle East editor and lecturer on modern Arab history. I also see some students of mine here. And really all my professional life, I was looking at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict with one hope and expectation, which was a two-state solution. Perhaps we also should say we believed in it with stubbornness, despite all odds. Or should I say, yeah, it was, perhaps the hope of the 1990s just changed into a certain, I don't know, refusal of reality. But we should remember, how did the Oslo process start? It started precisely because the Israeli left decided that they have to prevent what we are talking about here, that they wanted to prevent a one-state solution. And for a long time, and I will try to forget this now, for a long time for me the discussion about the one-state solution was mainly a means to pressure Israel in a way. It is not easy and even painful to recognize defeat, and we heard today that not everybody accepts this also. I mean, did we really reach the dead end? I mean, as the Palestinian ambassador said, I mean, is it really irreversible? Yes, I mean, intellectually I have understood that we have to talk also about alternatives, but I also have to admit that emotionally I'm lagging behind, and also from a practitioner's point of view. I mean, we heard the Egyptian ambassador, what he has to say, and I think he even thinks it's a danger. I mean, we are kind of jeopardizing what's going on now. I mean, really a consensus that we have to have this Palestinian state. Okay, so having said this, I really say that all the more I commend the scholars who deal with it and the bodies who facilitate this discussion, like the VICDC and also the Bruno Kreisky Forum, of course. And I really will try to, to forget my past as someone who was fully focused on the two-state solution here. But it's difficult. Okay, I want to share some thoughts. I also read your very interesting and challenging papers, and as I said, you have to forgive me about the lack of specialized expertise, and perhaps I will bring up questions which you have at least resolved for yourself, but perhaps for the audience they will be interesting. For example, thinking about the constitutional framework and equal citizenship, it sank in with me how varied these societies are we are talking about, especially the Israeli. And I think your 6 categories, there is even missing one. For example, I mean, more than one, but the non-Jewish Israeli citizens, old and new, like the Druze, for example. Not all, I mean, yeah, okay, complex. But okay, I have another one. the non-Jewish Russian immigrants. That doesn't matter. But there are many, but we have two main groups. I mean, Israeli Jews on the one side, and the Palestinians of the West Bank and in Gaza on the other side, and even the latter are divided by their history. And I think there are pitfalls, and even more, I mean, for thinking of these smaller groups, and I think even more so if a transformation has the aim to undo justices for one of which one of these two groups suffered. And so it will always be, this alternative state formation will always be a process which involves mainly those two groups, even if we expand the model to a multicultural state. And I think there is a lot of thinking to do about these groups if you don't want to create new imbalances. And there are also major questions how the identities of the two main groups would develop in such a process. And you mentioned this, of course, and who and how decides who belongs to that groups and who not. I also wonder, only on a practical level, I have to specify, I also wonder if the concept of indigenous on one side and colonial on the other side is helpful in this case. I mean, if you keep the concept, you keep the division in a way. You may insist, and of course you are right to say this is the correct description of the situation. Yes, but however, if the aim really is to break the impasse, you have to leave a lot of these categories behind in a way, and I don't know, find other names, or I really don't know. I mean, to take the birthright away from one group completely and just transfer it to another group, I think it's a practical no-go. I mean, I'm really talking about practical level. And of course, what does indigenous really mean? I mean, what's indigenous? How many years must a group live in an area to be called indigenous? Who defines the group? Do you need to show a birth certificate of your, I don't know, great-grandfather? I mean, I wouldn't be Austrian if I, I wouldn't be an indigenous Austrian if I would have to fulfill this criteria. The label indigenous is contested by two peoples, if we agree on it or not. Huh? It may be unjust, but it's there. And if you say it's nonsense, academically you cannot claim land someone you refer to and who is most probably genetical and not even your ancestor, as Shlomo Sand describes, and he has lived there 2,000 years ago. I mean, we just have to work with what we have. Huh? You cannot extinguish Zionism, you have to transform it, I think. And I think this is also why the South African experience, which anyway has its own difficulties, will not be accepted as a model by most Israelis. I want also question the summarily use of the concept of the right of return. I mean, no doubt this issue has to be addressed. I mean, we are facing deep injustices. The problems of the Palestinian refugee populations in other countries have to be resolved. But international experience should teach us, I mean, independently of if we talk about two-state or one-state solution, that these issues belong to more than just one domain. It's not only a political question, and it's also not only an emotional question. It's also really also concerning practical life. And to be honest, I mean, not everybody will want to hear that, but I refuse to believe that the Palestinian population in Palestine really wishes the return of all Palestinian refugees of these generations to Palestine. I mean, perhaps they would say it, perhaps they really do, perhaps they will welcome them with open arms, but on day 3, everything will be different, because then the cake will have to be divided into smaller pieces. I come to the problem which bothers me most, legitimacy. Thinking about the Oslo process and Dr. Hanier's critique of it, the question marks and the flaws behind this process, also the economy aspect of it, I think it was clear to most of us at a, I mean, not early stage, but quite, I mean, yeah, in the 90s. And I guess it was also clear what it meant for the credibility of the Oslo process in the eyes of the Palestinians. However, first of all, it was the only thing we had, and I think also at least this is what we thought, and probably also most Palestinians saw it in a similar way. We thought that the success Palestinian statehood as the one and only aim would provide the necessary legitimacy and support at the end. I mean, the paper of Dr. Hanier is a real eye-opener for me regarding the connection of the end of history after the end of the Soviet Union and the victory of neoliberal models, projection of US power, integration of capital, the Palestinian elites, and the Oslo process. And of course also other state-building processes after that time. However, even if I accept the embarrassing fact that I simply supported existing political and economical hierarchies by supporting Oslo, I do not yet quite see the ready alternative path. I mean, you say it has to be challenged, need to be challenged, but what does dismantling of the existing political economy really mean in practice? I mean, how long does it take? What does it mean for the people? How do we challenge the famous Palestinian elites? We dismantled the Palestinian Authority because it belongs to this complex. I mean, I just wished you would say more about it, about the practical ways. I have also learned during the last years, the years of the Arab Spring revolts, that it's so hard and so, I mean, almost impossible to measure legitimacy. I mean, you send the people to vote, you let the elected constituent assemblies write constitutions, you submit it to a referendum. Yes, of course, because this is our understanding of how people participate in political processes. But does it work in the way that it is creating a resilient, enduring consensus in the society? Or does it heal split societies? No, we really learned it does not. It absolutely does not. On the contrary, really on the contrary. Already the legislative elections in Iraq in December 2005 had the opposite effect. They accelerated centrifugal powers. And the old elites and also a few others did not accept the outcome. Neither did they in Palestine in 2006, nor in Egypt in 2012, nor in Libya in 2014. In Libya in 2014, the new elites, the Islamists, did not accept the outcome. And Yemen tried a totally different model, create legitimacy before you go to elections, and it did not work either. No? So what exactly is legitimacy? How do you create it? How do you measure it? What determines if it remains stable or not stable? And especially what makes you think that others than a two-state solution would gather more legitimacy and I mean, enduring legitimacy? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So before I give the word to the audience, perhaps one of you would like to, or both of you would like to comment before. Would you like to open up immediately, or would you like to just comment on something Gudrun said before?
mean, maybe we can come back to some of the points around the alternative, what is the alternative path? What concretely does it mean? I mean, at the very basis, I would say, from what I was talking about, it would mean opposing the kinds of policies that we see implemented by the Palestinian Authority in the areas under its autonomy, and that means things like both economic policies as well as the security policies, and I think that's something that really, I mean, this is not me saying this, I think this is something that's becoming more current among Palestinians in the area. It also means tackling the questions that Tarek raised around aid and the impact of aid on Palestinian society. But what's an alternative? It's not an easy question, and it's something that we come up against every day. But I think what it really does point to is that the alternative, in some ways, is going to emerge through a process of political struggle. I mean, that to me is how I look at it. And we lack at the moment any kind of political alternative. And initiatives like this might be part of such a thing, but it's a process of reconstituting the Palestinian political body, which has basically been decimated over since the Oslo process, and that to me brings me to the points you made around Oslo, because to my mind, and please, if you're recording this, don't just take what I'm about to say this little bit. I mean, what I mean is don't just take this out of context, because to my mind, Oslo was not a failure. It was a complete success. It's been one of the most successful political projects in the Middle East for the last 50 years. What I mean by this is that Oslo was never about achieving the legitimate rights of Palestinians. It was never about building a genuine Palestinian state in whatever form. It was never about ending conflict. It was about deepening and cementing Israeli colonialism and fragmenting the Palestinian political movement. And that has been incredibly successful. So I don't think that, I mean, you couldn't dream of a more successful way of achieving these goals. Now, does that mean that everyone who was involved in the process thought about it in this way? No, clearly they didn't. But I do believe that certainly was the logic driving it. So I don't agree that Oslo was a failure at all. Now, going beyond that, how do we build an alternative? It comes back to the necessity, I think, of a new kind of political movement among Palestinians.
Yeah, you raised two important points, and one of them was your rejection of the idea of colonialism or settler colonialism. And the way I use it is not really as a stigma, or say, you don't have any rights, so move on, or as a way to stigmatize a certain population. But I find that in my own research and other people's research, there are a number of things that you try to find explanations for. And you look really hard at comparative studies and what people experience and dealt with elsewhere. And you find it hard to escape the conclusion that we're not just dealing with an ethnic conflict where there's majority, minority, or two ethnic groups, and they're just fighting over territory and they have different claims, etc. There's an important dynamic that you need to look at in order to actually understand what's happening, which is the dynamic of colonialism, and mainly settler colonialism. And it's been something, actually, that the Palestinians have been talking about since the 20s, since the beginning of the Jewish immigration to Palestine. So the use is not as a stigma, but actually as purely as a tool to understand reality. And also at the same time, if you look at the pre-state literature on Zionism, And you see that even the recreation of the Hebrew language, you see that many of the words that are used are based on the idea of settling and settlements. Yishuv, hityashvut. If you look at the institutions, pre-state institutions, example, Palestine Colonial Fund, which was a fund created to colonize Palestine. Herzl himself used the idea of colonialism, and he said that that's what we're doing. We're doing like what Europe does elsewhere in Asia and Africa. So this alignment with colonialism is actually, not only it's reflective of reality, helpful in academic research and also in tackling practical issues, but it also has its history, and the history that was brought in not necessarily by Palestinians, but actually by pre-state Zionist activists and institutions. Obviously, if it's a barrier, then probably other descriptions could be used, but at the same time, we cannot really discount the value of such a paradigm to understanding the situation. The other issue of refugees' return. Well, it depends on return to Palestine, depends what we mean by Palestine and where to. Now, if refugees go from the, let's say, Syria, Lebanon, or Jordan to the West Bank, actually, true, there's no room there. Why? Because the West Bank and the Gaza Strip have their own fair share of refugees already. There are, for example, Gaza, 1.7 million people, probably 75% are refugees already. So in the sense of that there's no room, definitely there's no room. But in other places, the places where these refugees originate from, there is room. And there's actually studies that were conducted by Dr. Salman Abu Sitta, for example, who looked at the geographical spread of the population in Israel. And he classified these areas according to places where there were Palestinian towns and villages. And he said that in probably 80 to 70% of the situations or of the cases, the land is still vacant. But also at the same time, return is not necessarily imminent or that people have to return. It's an option. It's a right that people may wish to exercise, or they say, well, I'm very happy. I'm living my life to the maximum and happy with whatever I'm doing in whatever country I am in. So at the end of the day, it's an option, and the option should be there. But also when we talk about return, we need to know return to where, and think about the location and the dynamics of that. So that's